Let us now consider the left panel. This is often presented as the scene in the Garden of Eden, but we will see this is no conventional depiction of the Genesis story, but an enigmatic one which challenges interpretation. We will examine its imagery forensically rather than pushing an interpretation onto it. Only by seeing how the imagery is structured can we gain access to Bosch's intentions. The background has 5 tower-like structures set in a line receding from us as viewer. Thus, these are painted with gradually increasing deeper blue tones, which was a convention in early Flemish painting, used to create a sense of distance. The first structure on the left is a low tent or hut-like form, with a roof made of 2 leaves. It has a circular opening at the top, into which birds are flying, and a door at the front, around which a flock of herons, cranes or spoonbills gather. Immediately behind this is a much larger tower, whose base seems composed of slabs of rock, creating an interior space, on top of which is a small plateau, on which is set a large, hollowed-out sphere, somewhat similar to the base of the fountain. Heaped up beside this are more slabs of rock, and plant stems and leaves rise to form a high tower. From the lower part, a flock of birds emerge and fly in a spiral through the hollowed-out sphere high up into the sky, and then descend to enter the top of the first hut-like structure. In front of these 2 towers, a bird with black wings and a grey belly sits on a large eggshell, seeming to encourage a flock of similar birds to enter the open end of the egg. This paradoxical activity will be found depicted in other ways on the central panel. It is interesting that, in this upper part of the left panel, only birds are seen and no other creatures. This reflects the 5th day of creation, when God created the birds and commanded them to fly across the heavens. As we look into the distance, we firstly see the 3rd structure, which at its base seems like a natural hill with a cave, but its top appears to be a large mushroom, pierced through by some plant stem and tall trees. Birds play in its structure, and a large flock sits on the meadow in front of it. Set a little back from this is a tower, seemingly formed from an outer skin or shell, which has been cut away at the front and top, allowing some large slabs of stones to stand upright. At the top, a single stem rises up with a pendulous fruit. Only a few birds are seen around this structure. In the far distance, a hill is seen, formed from 2 large circular plates of stone, held together at the top by a large curving branch from a tree. A grove of trees grows out of the top. Few birds are here seen, and those are flying in the air. Similar stylized hills are found in early Italian and Flemish painting, but here Bosch pushes the form to its limits. Let us now look at the middle ground of this panel. This is centred around a lake. We will see that the middle ground of the other panels also have a body of water, the pool of women bathers in the central panel, and the frozen lake in the right panel. On the left we see various animals, a cow, horses, deer, and a unicorn drinking from the lake, while lower down herons, spoonbills and ducks feed, a commonplace scene. In the distance we see an elephant, a monkey, and a jackal-like creature. On the right are deer, a bear, a porcupine, boar, a giraffe and a rabbit in the foreground. On the right side of the lake, the side towards the central panel, a strange group of creatures emerges. Frogs, toads, lizards, and imagined hybrid amphibian forms leave the lake and seek shelter in rocks and caves. These scenes around the lake reflect the beginning of the sixth day of creation in Genesis, where God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." On an island in the lake stands a coral pink fountain, a hybrid of plant and mineral forms. The leaves with little barbs on their edges, which form much of its structure, are obviously those of the succulent southern European aloe. Another aloe, a tall tree found in India, was known as Lignum paradisii, the wood of paradise. This fountain has a triple structure. Its top part is totally plant-like, with a central stem emerging from leaves, and various shoots intertwine around one another. The middle section, while still incorporating aloe leaves, has an interior structure which appears more mineralized, with pipework carrying and then spraying forth water from spouts. The lowest part of the fountain appears to be a large spherical calabash or melon-like fruit with circular patterns on its skin. This image is used by Bosch twice in key components of the central panel. Here, a little owl looks out from the central hole in the front. It appears to be looking down at the scene with Adam and Eve and the Christ figure. The base of the fountain sits on a little island of bluish rocks. Scattered about this are pearls, transparent and red gems, and a number of cylindrical glass forms. These may have been inspired by the decorative canes and beads, often with marbleized surfaces, produced by the Murano glassmakers of Venice, which probably were familiar to Bosch. These adornments also appear in the central panel in various forms. We will now look at the foreground or lower part of this panel. The foreground scene shows a Christ-like figure presenting Eve to Adam, who is seated on the ground. The Christ-like figure raises his right hand and makes the conventional gesture of blessing. In the outer wings, God the Father made the same gesture on the earth from his throne high above. The appearance of this youthful Christ-like figure in this depiction of the creation of Eve is unconventional. Bosch, in his Haywain, created a decade or more earlier, adopts the more usual image of God as a bearded old man extracting Eve from the side of Adam. Back in the 1480s, Bosch had created his Last Judgment triptych, and there he used a youthful Christ-like figure standing over the sleeping Adam and appearing to be pulling Eve out of his side. The posture of Eve is exactly the same as in the Garden of Earthly Delights, though in that case Eve seems to be being presented to Adam. This simple reversal gives an entirely different meaning to this image. This scenario in the Garden of Eden must be seen as being before the temptation. Behind Adam is a strange tree. This is actually a good depiction of a southern European dragon tree. Around it a vine with grapes entwines, while behind are a grove of apple trees. On the other side of the panel stands a palm tree bearing fruits. Around its trunk a serpent twines itself. These two trees from Bosch's Garden of Eden are obviously taken from a woodcut in the Liber Chronicarum. This woodcut depicts the expulsion from Eden, but it seems clear that Bosch was depicting Eden before the temptation and expulsion. At the bottom of the lower part of this panel we find some mammals, rabbits, and a cat with a mouse, a menagerie of birds, a crow, magpie, and 9 imagined bird forms. These stand around a pond, and some have caught and are eating frogs. The pond itself teems with creatures: a water unicorn, a spoon-billed fish, a winged or flying fish, and various amorphous forms are seen in the dark water. A seal leaves the pool, and at the other end we see a monkfish, which Bosch has mischievously depicted reading a book. Before we move on to consider the central panel, let us summarise what we have discovered about the left one. It is to be read in 3 layers, from the top downwards. The topmost layer of the birds and the range of towers and hills hybridised from vegetable and rocky materials growing in the landscape is clearly a depiction of the 5th day of creation. The middle layer, teeming with potential life, has a living fountain of plants and minerals at its centre. All sorts of creatures live here, from familiar domestic animals to strange amphibians that hide in the rocks. This is the beginning of the 6th day of creation. The garden has the 2 trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, but the latter has not yet been violated. A solitary owl sits at the centre, gazing upon the meeting of Adam with his Eve. The lowest part is a depiction of the creation of Eve and her presentation to Adam by Christ. This is the Garden of Eden on the 6th day, before the temptation and fall. It is instructive to look at 2 paintings of the garden that were created in Bosch's workshop a decade or so after the Garden of Earthly Delights. The first is in Vienna and is entitled Paradise, or an Allegory of Vanity. Here we see Adam and Eve within the calabash shell, while behind them is a fountain rising through a hill. Many of the elements from the garden depicted in Bosch's work are seen here: the pool with birds, various animals, strange tower-like structures, but especially the fountain rising up through the hill. It also has a spherical component with a circular hole, but here it is not an owl that peers out, but a human being. Something similar is seen in the Garden of Paradise painting in the Art Institute of Chicago. Again, this is a workshop painting rather poorly executed and unlikely to have been worked upon by Bosch. Like the Vienna painting, it contains many of the elements from the Garden of Earthly Delights. In the foreground we see God the Father presenting Eve to Adam, but here Adam lies asleep, as in the conventional depictions of this biblical event. We see again the fountain incorporating a sphere with a window, and, as in the former painting, it is a human being, not an owl, that gazes out.